Good evening, bonsoir. Bonsoir Nigel.
Bonsoir Joris. Oui, il fait froid ici aujourd'hui.
Oui.
Donc un peu d'inspiration, je crois.
Voilà, ce soir on va explorer les Écritures. We're going to study Scripture together and break the word to keep us warm. Yes. Voilà. So thank you for joining us tonight for our series of Bible studies, pour notre série d'études bibliques. Tonight we're going to have a look at Mark chapter 10, verse 35 to 45. If you're following us online, don't hesitate don't hesitate to leave questions or remarks or things you want to share in the chat, and we'll try to engage with it. And after the Bible study, you can, if you're following us live, you can also join us for Zoom chat. Here we go.
Yes, we're at Mark 10, 35 to 45. So we sort of hopped back very slightly in Mark. And here is our opening prayer. Would you like me to say it, Joris, this evening? Let us pray. O blessed God, who caused all Holy Scripture to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and hold fast to the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Saviour Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So while we're reading, we're going to be reading it once in English and then in French and then in a paraphrase English translation from the Message. Just have a little look at it. No pressure, but perhaps something pops out to you. A word, a phrase, a theme of the reading. Doesn't have to be something even that you've thought of for the first time. It could be something that always strikes you about this particular passage, because there may be a way of looking at it through different eyes or confirming what we already think that the passage is about. So we're going to read it through, and if you want to drop something in the chat, or we'll also talk about it ourselves briefly afterwards about what strikes us after we've read it, and we'll go from there. So here it is, Mark 10. Actually, that's not it.
That's not it.
That is last week's. Oh dear, something has gone wrong.
The wrong slideshow.
It's the wrong slideshow. Very sorry. We're going to go back here just for one moment while we sort this out. This is probably my fault, actually. I clicked on the first thing in here. So where will it be then? That should be... Hang on. Let's go up here and go to the Google Drive. I should have checked it more thoroughly beforehand.
Ça fait rire.
Google Drive. Sign in. Do we have to sign in, or will it go straight in? Yes, it went straight in. Here it is. Is this it? Why is it not opening? Open with Google Slides. Yes, here we are. Problem solved. And we're going to view slideshow. There we go. Sorry about that. We're back in business. Okay. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it's not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Maintenant, dans la traduction française, now in the French translation. Alors Jacques et Jean, les fils de Zebedee, viennent auprès de Jésus. Ils lui disent : « Maître, nous désirons que tu fasses pour nous ce que nous te demanderons. » « Que voulez-vous que je fasse pour vous ? » leur dit Jésus. Ils lui répondirent : « Quand tu seras dans ta gloire, accorde-nous de siéger à côté de toi, l'un à ta droite, l'autre à ta gauche. » Mais Jésus leur dit : « Vous ne savez pas ce que vous demandez. Êtes-vous capable de boire la coupe de douleur que je vais boire, ou de recevoir le baptême dans lequel je vais être plongé ? » Ils lui répondirent : « Nous en sommes capables. » Jésus leur dit : « Vous boirez en effet la coupe que je vais boire, et vous serez baptisés du baptême où je vais être plongé. Mais ce n'est pas à moi de décider qui siégera à ma droite ou à ma gauche. Ces places sont à ceux pour qui Dieu les a préparées. » Quand les 10 autres disciples entendirent cela, ils s'indignèrent contre Jacques et Jean. Alors Jésus les appela tous et leur dit : « Vous le savez, ceux que l'on regarde comme les chefs des peuples les commandent en maîtres, et les personnes puissantes leur font sentir leur pouvoir. Mais cela ne doit pas se passer ainsi parmi vous. Celui qui veut devenir grand parmi vous sera votre serviteur, et celui qui veut être le premier parmi vous sera l'esclave de tous. Car le Fils de l'homme n'est pas venu pour être servi, mais pour servir et donner sa vie comme rançon pour libérer une multitude de gens. »
And here it is from the Message. James and John, Zebedee's sons, came up to him. "Teacher, we have something we want you to do for us." "What is it?" "I'll see what I can do." "Arrange it," they said, "so that we will be awarded the highest places of honor in your glory, one at your right and the other at your left." And Jesus said, "You have no idea what you're asking. Are you capable of drinking the cup I drink, of being baptized in the baptism I'm about to be plunged into?" "Sure," they said. "Why not?" Jesus said, "Come to think of it, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized in my baptism. But as to awarding places of honor, that's not my business. There are other arrangements for that." When the other 10 heard of this conversation, they lost their tempers with James and John. Jesus got them together to settle things down. "You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around," he said, "and when people get a little power, how quickly it goes to their heads. It's not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not to be served, and then to give away his life in exchange for many who are held hostage."
Good. It's always striking with the Message. I find that some things that kind of pop or shine through in a more direct way. I find with this, paraphrase, it's kind of come through in quite interesting way. It's not going to be that way with you. I thought it's kind of a very direct way of
not
putting
going
it.
to be that way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. It's quite, for me, it raises a very interesting question that often go through my mind is to what extent is actually the church today going the way of the world, and that's always a question that I think about, working in the church as well.
Yes, yeah. It's funny, isn't it, how for me that popped out too. It made me wonder if Jesus knew what was going to happen to the disciples when he called them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And it's Fred has said, I think it's funny, it says little power going to somebody's head. It's often the ones with the littlest power that throw it around.
Petit chef.
Petit chef. That's true, isn't it? Yeah, yes. Give somebody a clipboard and they're off, they say.
Yes.
Yeah. The other thing that struck me about it was that how he uses the word baptism.
Yes, yeah.
It seems sort of odd, and it's in all three translations. It's clearly there in the Greek as well, that you will be baptized in my baptism. I mean, it's very interesting how that is clearly a reference to death.
Yeah, yeah.
And how the disciples weren't able to understand that still, even though he told them that he was going to die.
Yeah, it's the third time we'll see.
Yeah. So, and the link between baptism and death that comes out in this, as well as in Paul's writings and John the Baptist and Jesus himself. I mean, I don't think he teaches much about baptism, does he, Jesus, in the Gospels? He's baptized himself by John the Baptist, and he tells people to go out and be and baptize others in the Great Commission. But there's not much teaching about baptism by
the nature
by
of it. Yeah.
But here it is at the heart of one of his most important things he said to the disciples.
Yeah, and linking it to his witness in death. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, there we are. Those were some of our first thoughts. We're certainly going to look at the nature of power and what that actually means or what it's supposed to mean in the church, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, the questions are prepared by the Episcopal Church, recommended for Bible study on this text, and kind of pointing in that direction as well, of course. What does our society teach us about how to become great? Very interesting in this political season.
Yes.
What would it look like for us to follow Jesus' command to be a servant to others in today's society? Leadership involves serving, not ruling. Again, interesting, considering the upcoming elections. How well does the church leadership reflect this teaching, and also with the upcoming convention of the Diocese of New York in November?
I have to admit that last question was mine.
Well, that's a good one as well.
It's not so that I'm part of the Episcopal Church. It wasn't in the official Bible study questions.
Okay, that's great. That's a good one. You probably have a lot to say, Nigel, with your experience in leadership in the church as well. Without giving away any names.
No. Well, let those without sin cast the first stone, maybe.
Exactly. Well, we're going to have a look talking about casting stones. We're going to have a look at the context of Jesus' address to his disciples then, and we'll see that actually it's on his ascent to Jerusalem where he is going to be the object of everybody's vindication and eventually killed. And so we hear in the Gospel of Mark, this passage has come, it's really just following the third and final passion prediction of Jesus. So Jesus is announcing to his disciples that he is going up to Jerusalem to die and resurrect, to rise. So the first passion prediction, that's the one we studied a couple of weeks ago, where He rebukes Peter, famously, the one who is declared to be the rock. Now he's said to be Satan because he's setting his mind on
earthly things.
Things. The second passion prediction, it's when the disciples really don't understand what he's saying, and they're also afraid to ask, which is interesting because on our text today, they're not afraid to ask. And not at all.
It's the wrong thing, but
yes.
they're not afraid
So maybe
to
they learn
ask it.
from the second passion lesson, but not in the good way. And the third one, which just preceded our text, the disciples are really kind of amazed of what Jesus is going to do, and it's followed by this kind of we're unpacking this announcement, I think, with this discussion about the glory. They think he's going up also to Jerusalem to go to his glory, because if you read the description of Jesus' passion, or the prediction of Jesus' passion, you might think that he's actually going to fight for 3 days or some sort, if you don't pay much attention, and then he will be resurrected and be ruling over everybody. So they might think, okay, well, we'll struggle, he'll struggle, there will be some death involved, maybe he's talking in symbols and things, and then he will be risen and, will have power. So they're trying to figure out, how to map out the power for when, it works. So that's kind of we're walking in the footsteps of this prediction here in our text. So that's really important to keep this in mind as we study this passage of scripture that has to do with power and how you participate or grab the power of God.
I think Casal makes a very good point there, summing up the passage, saying that it's a call to each of us to evaluate whether or not we want to be a part of Jesus' glory. And that's interesting because Casal has linked it there with service. How do we serve believers in the church in whatever skills we might have? And glory is about service, not about unearned credit.
Exactly, yeah, that's what we'll see a little bit. So the passage is quite interestingly put, as I said, because it's just followed by the healing of the blind man, right?
Yes, yes, that's right.
So it kind of frames this. I mean, all of Mark is about blindness in many ways. The disciples they have eyes, but they don't see, ears, but they don't really hear. And here they are once again being kind of misunderstood and going to grab things that they're not really supposed to grab. And it's at the core of these revelations about Jesus' passion. Actually, Jesus is teaching about who he is. He's teaching about him being the Messiah, but a very unlike Messiah to what the disciples are expecting. They're expecting kind of a glorious Maccabeus type of maybe form of political leader who would lead them into victory. Here they have someone who is announcing some form of figured prediction about what he's going to live, that is, he will be betrayed, killed, and risen as the Son of Man. So he's using this prophetic title as well. So that's very much the core of the identity he's been explaining to his disciples now for many chapters since the beginning of his ministry. And that's been really a whole section where he's trying to train his disciples in understanding what's leadership and what is leadership and what's his call and what are their calls also as their followers. They're supposed to be patterned on his own identity as the Son of Man who is going to give his life a ransom for many. So there is definitely this attempt from Jesus to explain his identity and thinking that it will also shape theirs, but apparently they're still very much influenced by other way of thinking about your identity that have to do with power grabs, abuse, self-centeredness. That's very unlike what Jesus is doing.
It's interesting, isn't it, that it comes after the commissioning of the disciples to go out to proclaim the good news. And we were reflecting on that the other week, thinking what was the good news? Because Jesus hadn't, he'd not been crucified and risen again, but the disciples were still out proclaiming. And I'm sure that part of their message wasn't die to live.
No, yeah.
That their message was be delivered, put to death your sin, or to expelling demons. That was clearly part of that mission. But here, if the disciples had identified themselves in that way with Jesus, they would have seen their proclamation message as a message of service and sacrifice rather than just delivering the less fortunate.
Yeah.
I don't know, perhaps I'm reading too much into that.
No, I mean, it's interesting because when you see that they don't seem to actually get what Jesus has been doing, you wonder what they've actually been teaching. But I would say it's the same with the church today.
Well, yes, that's true.
There's no difference. Leaders in the church, and all of us, I think, can say that. We've heard many times what the good news is and try to pattern our life on Jesus's life, but it doesn't mean that we don't go after power grabs and are anxious about our position and status and will we have enough or will we not. So this is, in a sense, probably, even if you have the good news at the get-go, do you actually let it sink in you and transform you? That's another another step, I guess.
Yeah.
So we can nevertheless have a look at what Jesus has been teaching really to his disciples so far. So there are a couple of points that are quite clear in his teaching, which doesn't mean that it's actually landed, That's what he's been teaching. But it might not have landed, and we can say very much the same for today. I mean, that's definitely always come back. That's what Martin Luther said. He was always preaching the same gospel
Yes.
and again and again every Sunday. We need to be reminded all the time of the gospel's way because it's so unlike the ways of the world, and the ways of the world are always present to us and trying to captivate us as well. So the first thing that Jesus is teaching is that the disciples are to deny themselves for Jesus and the gospel's sake, and also that implies accepting worldly shame. That implies that as we saw recently, also receiving persecutions, and that's definitely something they might experience and they will experience, as we see. It also implies that the disciples are to focus on Jesus and his words above all others. That's really putting Jesus and his relationship with God the Father as the central source of their action. It implies also that the disciples are to remain dependent on God's power to do God's work. Really, that's the focus. That's kind of what's lacking here when we see in his interaction with Jesus. They're trying to define power on human terms and their own advantage and interest, even in doing away with God the Father, and that Jesus reminds them that actually he's here, just like he did actually last week when we see when this man comes to him and says, "Good teacher." And Jesus says, no, only God is good. And here is once again reminding them that his ministry exists only in relationship to the Father and in service to the Father's will. And so here you have, that's very central also in our text, that he says, it's not for me to decide who will have the place of honor. And the disciples are also not to compete with each other. and try to grasp glory on their own term. That's a very interesting thing, because if you know, in Hebrew scripture, that comes again and again, the attempt to define good and evil on your own terms is the first sin of humanity. It's the grasping of the fruit of the tree of knowing good and bad in the Garden of Eden against what God has said, which was not to eat from this tree. So the relationship to good and bad becomes priority over actually listening to God, and that's or being in relationship with God. And that's what Jesus is always pointing out, and especially in this passage, I would say.
It's also interesting when you think what the question of the disciples was around that. It was about proximity, about that they wanted to be close to the source of power because that's what would make them powerful. But the cross is an inversion of that. It's as far away from power as you can get. Yeah. And I think very often for us, if we're thinking in worldly terms, the closer you are to the source of power, the more power you're going to have. If you have the ear of the president, or the ear of the mayor, or the ear of the bishop, or the person in power, you're supposed to feel more powerful yourself. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. He's saying that's not mine to grant. That's somebody else's business, not mine. You might think you're powerful because you're in proximity to me and you want to be in closest proximity to me, but that's not the way the kingdom of God works.
Yeah. And in a very paradoxical way, the one who are going to give him the place of honor are the people who are going to condemn him. And that's how he's going to be elevated on this very unlikely throne on the cross.
Yeah, with two very different people on his right and left.
Exactly, yes. And he will be baptized. I mean, the cup that he's going to drink and the baptism he will receive will be the way of his glory, really. But very unlike what the disciples imagine, of course.
Yes, here's Jesus teaching his disciples in this very condensed passage, actually. It's quite short in comparison to some of the others that we've been looking at. At the end of the reading there, he says, choose the role of the least of all. Become a servant to all, a slave to all. It echoes with his other sayings that the first will be last and the last will be first. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, he says. Secondly, to relinquish control on how this is going to work out. Nobody's pulling the levers here to make certain things happen in certain ways. This is a relinquishment rather than a grasping, as you've talked about, Joris. This is a letting go rather than a seizing. Give up that need to be controlling when you're doing anything for God. It's funny, isn't it, how nowadays perhaps we would put that very slightly differently to say, give me a program, give me a strategy. I want 5 points to be able to accomplish this so that my vision of the world, free from X, Y, or Z, will come about. And I think, we're being asked here to let go of that even and let God do the work and not let the strategy or the levers or the control over the business to do
It's
the
interesting
work.
because you say, because the idea is that to have my vision of the world come out, or my positionality or my experience of things. And that's really what Jesus is trying to do. He said, the focus is not on you. It doesn't come from you. It doesn't even come from me. That's what he's saying. He says it comes from God. And that's, the source, literally the source, like as the spring of all the glory and power is not in me to give you. It comes from God as I surrender to his glory. and I'm giving glory in that regard, but you're also going to participate as much as you want to participate, as much as you will participate, really. So that's very interesting to see that. I find that it's not about shaping a vision and then trying to follow a vision, which once again is kind of defining good and bad on your terms and then trying to follow it, even if it's very wise or as wise as you can on your human intelligence and terms or experience. But that's a very different way of relating. It's relating with a personhood and the person of God rather than with a set of experience or statistics or analysis.
Yes, it's so tempting to be a teacher in this sense, but Jesus wasn't just a teacher. He wasn't sort of teaching people how to think rightly or how to behave rightly, because that, in a sense, a teacher is in a position of control and power.
Exactly. That's interesting because when I'm coming back again to the Gospel of last week, he says, good teacher.
Good teacher, yes.
And Jesus said, no, I'm not good teacher. Yeah.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Also keeping children at the centre of their work.
Yeah.
And we've looked at this a couple of times before about what is it about childlikeness, if there's a word, that Jesus admires and wishes to recommend as a way of becoming a disciple.
Yeah.
And we looked at that in terms of obedience.
Yeah, and what struck me also really, like rethinking about that through the lens of today's text, is that if you want to actually levy an army, or if you want to, think of even today in like season of political, if you're doing a political campaign, you have no interest of having children running around, No. Like they're actually hindrances into, you can go to war with children. I mean, I know some children of a certain age can be used to be soldiers, but that's not, that's not what Jesus points. He says, like, basically understand them and see how the viewpoint, the way they are in relation to the world, to God, is a model of how you're supposed to be a disciple, which is very unlikely. Children don't work in capitalistic companies. They're not, as we said, they're not productive, but they're also not. They cannot really work within a ideological. You have to really force them into being some form of ideological instruments, but it's not. Yeah. It's not the most easy thing to do.
No, they're asking too many questions all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yes, that's right. And that final point that we shouldn't become burdened by possessions, but we should be open to receive gifts from God. I think a lot of Mark's Gospel, and we'll look at it briefly towards the end, this business about whom do you serve comes up time and time again. And we heard last week about the rich young man who was serving his possessions. And this whole business about service and obedience comes out really very strongly in that final verse of this reading that we had today. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Serve others, serve God. What do we serve? Do we serve power? Do we serve possessions? Do we serve security? Do we serve an ideology? Yeah. Do we serve our own image of ourselves in reference to what we think is good in the world, or virtuous, or worthy of praise? What are we serving? Yeah. What image of ourselves are we serving?
Yeah, it's a very important way and very interesting way of putting it, I think. Yeah. Yeah. What you just mentioned relates to the core paradox or like problem at stake in our text, and once again is the clash between Jesus's upside down worldview, upside down kingdom, and the reality of this world, and there's no reconciliation about that. There's really two different ways you can go your way, and Jesus' teaching about leadership really deconstructs common forms of leadership, be it political, be it religious, but I would say also in the family, many ways, and how patriarchal society work is being challenged by Jesus. So what the disciples are offered as a terms of model of leadership to be in servant of others and of the least doesn't match at all with what the Sadducees, the Pharisees, Herod was doing, and I would say a father in his own family as well. So it's a very unlike way of serving. It's the way God has been serving his people since the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, for sure. That's how he actually imagined also kingship in the first. The ideal kingship was supposed to be one of service, which didn't work out, of course. But that's definitely how God envisions leadership, because leadership is there to be of service, just like to go back in this Eden-like setting of being of service, to keep and till, and being in relationship to God, and not one of ruling over each other through social circles and spheres and techniques, be them religious, political, or anything else, really. So it doesn't. Jesus' leadership doesn't offer itself as giving them shares into some form of glory, or it's not. They're not going to be partakers into his cabinet and have different positions and ruling over this or that part of the world. I mean, when you see actually, the spreading of the gospel, it's interesting because some of the disciples are sent to this or that part, but they're not really ruling over it. It's not a split of power. Jesus is still Lord over all the world, right? And Jesus' upside-down leadership also reveals the lethal power that's being exerted by the world. And he's mentioned that in a very interesting way earlier when he says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And it's interesting, this image of the yeast, because it really suggests that, just a little bit of it can make everything rise, not rise for life eternal, but rise and become spoil the dough, basically. And so here, that's definitely what we're starting to see with the disciples. So it's a bit worrisome to see that they have still a little bit of this yeast of the Pharisees and Herod creeping into the good bread of the kingdom that they're supposed to share.
Fred's point there about a little power going a long way, a little tiny bit of yeast in comparison to the amount of flour that goes into a loaf. It's quite an interesting thought.
So just a pinch of power-hungry leadership, of hierarchical and paranoid control, because that's what Jesus is addressing, is enough to destroy the Church of Jesus, the movement of Jesus, wherever it's Jesus is calling us to serve. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
So interesting in a church context as well, because in preparation for being a priest, I suppose people get trained a little bit around this. I'm not sure how well I was trained in it, but certainly some of the priests that I worked with at the beginning, they would give pieces of advice, things like, if they're not doing it, do it yourself and give them the credit for it. You think, well, that sounds quite good because it empowers people to think that they can do things. But then it's so easy for the person who's exercising power in this invisible way to begin to congratulate themselves for it, on their ability to manipulate people into doing things unconsciously, even if they're good things. And that can be a dangerous way of exercising power. Or the fact is that wherever 3 or 4 human beings get together, there's an electric charge of power in the air. We can't help it. That's like these creatures here setting on the elk or whatever it is in the middle. It's almost as if we can't help it. So, one of the pieces of advice that's sometimes given to priests is whenever you go into a church, there's going to be power in the air. And if you do not exercise it, somebody else will.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. So accept the fact that there's power in the air, be conscious of it, offer that to God, and decide how you might want to see that play out in that community in a way that builds people up rather than gives people power to knock other people down.
Yeah.
But it's exercised in the most invidious ways. I think yeast is an extremely good way of those two forms of power, religious power and secular power, there in Pharisees and Herod. Well, there we go.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting what you're saying, Nigel. Well, we can talk a bit more as we go also. Especially because now we're actually encountering how the disciples are actually, not grasping it. I mean, they're trying to, but they don't get what Jesus is actually giving them. They try to grasp something else, but so it's kind of I would say kind of a disappointment if you were Jesus and have been all this way. It's the third prediction of his passion. He's kind of trying to transfer them, I would say, the pattern of their life, have them pattern on his own life, and then they don't get it once again. And on top of it, it's the earliest disciples who haven't got it, It's not some latecomer. So they've been all the way. They've left their nets, so they've left some of their property, they've left who they were to follow Jesus. And yet they desire personal glory and power. And what's also quite interesting, they use kind of manipulation. They take Jesus apart. They talk to him on separately. So they may be trying to, cut the line,
Yes.
In certain ways. So there's not only, a relationship to the disciples and Jesus, but it's also wreaking havoc in the company of the disciples. And then you have the other disciples who kind of go against, rise against the two and are really annoyed by what they have been doing. So you see that if Jesus were not there to actually clear up the mess that this claim of power has done, then, they may actually be all disbanded. So that's kind of the beginning of, the yeast is rising in Jesus.
Yes.
Puffs it and puts it down. But it's definitely some form of, another way of thinking in relation to the divine power that's happening there. And Jesus has to intervene. And what's quite interesting is that the responses go like, they don't just say, okay, that's fine. They actually insist. So there is something quite interesting there, because Jesus' response has in mind his upcoming rejection, yet they miss really the point that he's going to be rejected. They say, yes, we're able to drink the cup and do what you're going to do. And that's a moment what I find is kind of crucial, because so far Jesus has been predicting about his own passion, right? He's predicted his own passion 3 times, and now he's almost predicting their passion.
Yes.
And that's kind of a foreshadowing of the life of disciples, of all disciples, just after Jesus has predicted his own passion 3 times. So that he's actually, when they think they're going to walk to glory, he's predicting their own passion at this moment. Their unlikely glory through the passion. And so there's a huge discrepancy here, because Jesus, is reluctant to go to his passion. He's doing it as a form of surrender, because he knows the in and out of everything. Whereas they are totally they're running for it. They're eager. They say, yes, let's do it. But because they actually they miss, or they don't fully see or comprehend what it's going to be like.
I should have looked up this word, we are able, in the Greek to...
It's dynamos.
Dunamos, we have
Yes.
the power to do
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
We have power.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a very interesting, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's a very interesting text. And for this purpose, it's quite interesting to see that in Acts 12, 1-2, that's when we're told how James dies. And now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And he's the first apostle to be martyred. Here you see a depiction of it. So there's this discrepancy, but at the same time a form of foreshadowing of their own passion. So I think there's a form of hope there, maybe.
Yes.
But they're actually, even if now they don't get it, later they will, and they will become these great apostles, right? And martyrs as well of Jesus.
Yes, remembered to today.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, as mentioned, the 10 react, and Jesus answers also eventually to the whole situation, kind of to clear up everything. Their anger is quite interesting because maybe they think they've missed an opportunity that the two got for themselves. So there's definitely something of rivalry at stake there. And if you remember the Genesis, the different steps into the decay of humanity from the Garden of Eden, brotherly rivalry is the next step. That's what happens between Cain and Abel. That's really the step that comes after the grasping from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, good and bad. And so that's here you see it's coming. You kind of expected it, and it's going to destroy the community. And what's quite interesting is that to actually counter or kind of criticize what they've been doing, Jesus insults them in a certain way. He says that what they're doing is very unlike what Israelites should do, and all of them are Israelites. They're actually behaving like Gentiles. That is, they're behaving, maybe today we'd say pagans, basically. You're not a good Christian, you're a pagan. And so that's what Jesus is hinting to. He says, you are actually using power like people in big business are doing. That's not how I imagine. It's not how God has imagined first His chosen people to be when He set them apart to be a different way of living together. Of course, it fell throughout the Hebrew Bible. We see it, and we see that it's also fading now with His own disciples. So then He has to re-explain what true leadership and service is in His mind, which is very consistent with the way God has imagined being in relationship with human, really from the beginning, which is one of forming us to be co-rulers with God, but through service, which is what He has been setting up since the very beginning. And we've failed because we want to define good and bad and follow our own vision on our own terms without relating personally to God. And so Jesus shows that there are really competing actions and attitudes that are shaping these two ways of being. And He's pointing the disciples towards the way that's eventually the way of life, the way that leads you to this unlike tree of life.
Yes, it's very interesting, this sacrificial and selfless form of servicehood. What does that actually look like in practice? If you look at the other end of that scale, which is the self-aggrandizement and self-centered form of attempting to serve others, leads very often to this sort of lording over people, even charitable lording over people, that's motivated by a certain sense of pity rather than a sense of solidarity or empathy or living into your own suffering, and seeing that in the context of the suffering of others. So you get this sort of lording over business, patronizingly, or actually believing oneself to be better than other people and knowing better than other people and telling them what they should and shouldn't do. So this has a sort of domino effect. It knocks on from one person to another. So the person who gets abused in this way will end up abusing the person below them, and or that they believe is below them, all the way to the weakest in the world's eyes at the end of the line. Children, very often. And that's, as Joris has pointed out, that's one of the reasons that Jesus is lifting children up. They're at the end of this pecking order of worldly power. And Jesus is saying, you must become like that in order to be able to serve and to be obedient. The children become this paradigm. The disciples ought to be welcoming them, not scandalizing them or turning them away or saying that the master has got better things to do than mess around with the least in the pecking order. We should be learning from them. We ought to let Jesus bless them for what they're offering to us in terms of a paradigm for our own behavior. That we shouldn't lose sight of.
Yeah.
It's very interesting how that all links together, because he doesn't just predict his own death several times, and he doesn't just say the last shall be first and the first shall be last. He also talks about children several times over.
Yeah, it's kind of a running paradigm, I would say, in these teachings of Jesus before during his ascent to Jerusalem, Yeah, Jesus really stands here as a paradigm, and his identification with little children is very, very potent. We saw it last week also when we looked at the closeness he has with the children, but also the fact that and once again in our text, he refers to himself as the Son of Man.
Child himself.
Yes, he's a child himself. Is in this relationship of dependence, which the disciples are not when they're trying to define, to map out the next political administration on their own terms. They actually are very bossy.
Yes,
really
very childish. It's a really childish question. Yes. I want to be the boss.
Yeah, they're very
bossy. King of the castle.
Yes, exactly.
Let me be your friend. It's a sort of playground exchange in a certain sort of way.
Yeah,
it's childish, not childlike.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, Jesus embodies really God's activity and that's how it's interesting, to judge and bring salvation into our use of power, because there's a form of judgment Jesus gives there, like in terms of there's a discernment or a teaching, a judgment. I would say judges what they've been, how they've construed power, and yet he does it in order to bring life. You see, to bring salvation into our disordered use of power, our disordered grasping of the glory that we inherit because of our being human, that the power that God surrenders to us because of who we are as human. I mean, this Pascal was talking about, when we're la grandeur de l'homme, we're grand, we're God's creature. We have, but we also have misery, les misères, and that's definitely this that the disciples are embodying now. But Jesus is kind of reorientating them, guiding their understanding of power, so that they can be the disciple of God. They can move forward. They can go beyond this, like navel-gazing attitude, and be bringing life into the world, just like he is doing. So it's. I think that what I found interesting is that there's this dimension of judgment that comes with the cross as well. Not judgment in sense of condemnation, but of reordering. Just like when justice works well, the judgments help moving on, and is supposed to help reconciliation, help the recognition of the victim, but also a human attitude toward the person who has committed a crime or a fault, right? That's what the rite of reconciliation is about as well in the church. And so there is definitely, and when you think that he's talking about the cross, which is this very unlikely throne that he's going to have, and that is there's also that he's going to, the disciples are going to rule with him in many ways. So it invites us to participate this sense of pattern that Jesus is giving us, which is the pattern of the cross, the pattern of service, and the image and the reality of being a slave to the least, which is interesting because a slave is not just an employee. It's very different.
Yes.
A slave receives the order, as the centurion we've heard a couple of weeks ago said. I say to my servant, my slave, go, and he goes. And so there is this sense of surrender, total surrender, in the reality of slavehood, and also that it's your whole self, it's your heart, it's your soul, it's your mind, it's your strength. Servanthood is very total. Total not for self-aggrandizement. It's total here not to serve the narcissistic interest of the master, but to serve God himself. So that's kind of also a subversion of servanthood, of course, that Jesus is doing here. Is not saying, slavery is good. Is using the pattern, the reality of slavery, the paradigm of it, as a way to show the disciples how power works when it's working for the life of the world and not for narcissistic interests.
In the Garden of Gethsemane there, where he's drinking the cup, saying, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless not my will, but your will be done. And that a servant, a slave, essentially has no will of their own. They're there to serve the will, the whim of the master. Their potency is entirely the potency of the master, not their own potency. And this whole business of giving up one's heart, soul, mind and strength to God's will, to God's power, to God's agency in the world, and leaving aside any idea that we can simply be completely autonomous and appropriate that or grab it in some way to make it our own, is turning it the wrong way around.
Yeah. It is, and what's very interesting, to come back to Gethsemane, is that here there is definitely an echo to Gethsemane. All the more that when Jesus goes until his passion, that the disciples are walking in his footsteps. They're not doing their own little passion on their own terms. No. And that's very important to insist on that, because he's going there and he lets the other one go so that none of my little ones
shall be lost.
Be lost.
Yeah.
None of your little one, because it's a quote from the prophet, the Psalm, would be lost. So there is the same thing here. That's might explain Jesus' reaction. That's no, you're not going to drink the cup. You're not going to be baptized. Maybe as was his first thought, and then he thinks, oh, actually yes, but after, you see. Yes. Not I'm doing the work, I'm going first. Then when you enter in the life of the kingdom, when you walk where I have already led the way and killed death, then you'll be able to continue the work. But I think that's an interesting point, because that also helps us relate to our sense of servanthood and passion also in suffering. When we look at it through Jesus' passion and suffering, in a way that's not self-centered, and they might have, even led or imagined a form of passion that would have been a bit narcissistic. But since our passion, even our suffering, is always related, always already related, and lived through Jesus' suffering and Jesus' passion, then it cannot even be our own.
Yes, I got a couple of little quotations about that at the end, talking about how this passage has been read not just in terms of secular versus religious ideas of power, but how it's been read in the mystic tradition. What does it mean to become a servant of all? And how does power relate to mysticism, for instance, or our experience of the immanence of God, the closeness of God, and especially when it comes to suffering.
Yeah. Well, we're continuing to dive into this mystery of power, because it is, and we see that the mystery of power, which is also reality, is deeply linked for us as Christians to the passion of Christ, and Christ as the pattern of life-giving power. And life-giving use of power. And power and glory is very much synonym, I would say, in many ways, in the biblical imagination. So what does it tell us about our own exercise of power, what Jesus has been teaching, and how he's kind of reorientated the disciples' misunderstanding of what power is supposed to be like, and what glory is supposed to be like? Well, interestingly enough, it shows us, I think, because we are disciples as well, that we often fail to lead like Jesus does. We often fail to understand power like we should. Like Jesus shows us that Jesus lives literally. Because he doesn't point us to a certain form of power. He embodies through his life and his life now this form of power that we are supposed to imitate. So that's really invites us to also self-examination and discernment, to see, how are we misled maybe in our leadership. So it's always something that you have to think, be it at work, be it in your family, be it in political decisions as well that we have to make. So there are many contexts in which we are all given positions of leadership that we often fail to live up to this reality of power. And what Jesus shows us is that great leadership comes with or in learning, humbly learning, receiving, being in the childlike position. And he also shows us that there's always compassion. There's always a possibility of a new beginning. And James and John, ignorance is corrected, and we know that they're going to go on and become great disciples and great, they'll share in the likely glory of Jesus. So it's definitely a way also for us, a way of learning leadership and this use of power.
I think that's why it's important that churches have a strong laity, because not just because it curbs the power of the priest, though heaven knows that's often very important, but because if you deprive people of responsibility and power in responsibility, you're depriving them of an opportunity to learn. Yeah. And then we may not learn very nice things about ourselves sometimes, but had we not had an opportunity to operate within Christ's body making these sorts of reflections that we're making tonight, we would never have learned things about ourselves. I know it's a great privilege of being a leader in the church or anywhere, I suppose. The privilege isn't that you get to boss people around or shape a community in the image that you would like to see it shaped. It's also an opportunity to see sides of yourself that would otherwise remain completely invisible and unused.
That's very interesting, because I think it ties closely to the fact that the use of power is this thing that's in the air. That's very much the glory of God. And you cannot really understand who you are if you don't relate to this glory of God. And as the beginning of Calvin's institution, actually, the knowledge of yourself and the knowledge of God are definitely tied. And how can you learn who you are? You can learn it by relating to power, to both the power, the opportunities, the gifts, learning how to use them, and that's exerting power. And also, by whenever you are in position of power, or when power is being exerted on you, how do you relate to that, and how you learn from that? The constraints of all of this. Often the suffering as well that's being coming onto you. There are some form of powers as well, if they're not exerted directly by human. So our relationship through our experience of power, we get to discern God. And that happens, and we get to discern ourselves as being reflection of God's glory as well. So it's a very intimate, what can seem very political, and I think you're going to come to that with your discussion with mysticism, is actually a very spiritual practice.
Yes,
and Nigel, you'll often talk about building a budget, and we are about to make the budget, but the budget is also power.
Yes, it is.
And it's also very deeply spiritual. What is more political and spiritual than money.
Yes.
And that was your sermon today. If you want to hear also a sermon that talks about that, Nigel's sermon today on Wednesday talked about the church as actually the place where you can make mistakes. If there are a place when you can make mistake and learn from them and move on, is the church. And that's definitely what Jesus does with his disciples.
Yes,
once again.
It's encouraging.
And so I think it's interesting because it links power also and misuse of power with forgiveness.
Yeah.
And forgiveness is a way of releasing power, literally. The healing that the disciples are taught to do is, and what's going to happen actually just next in our passage of Mark, this healing of the blind man, has to do with power too. They're called acts of power that Jesus are doing, right?
Yes, that's right.
We tend not to understand healing so much in terms of power, maybe today.
No.
Because we have a very medical way.
It's a very therapeutic understanding
way of it.
Yes.
But that's a very interesting way of looking at it, to see that this question of Jesus' power in our passage, which seems kind of just political, is actually linked to the healing that's happening.
Yes.
Because of the...
It's also interesting in Mark's Gospel, I was just reading this earlier on, more than any of the other Gospels, the other three Gospels, in Mark's Gospel there's this real emphasis by other people saying he's exercising the power of Beelzebub to defeat Beelzebub.
Yeah.
And he's often accused of magic, which is all about power over other things, by manipulating words, by manipulating things to exercise power over the world, power over disease, power over the winds and the waves, power over something. And yet, a bit more than perhaps the other Gospels, here in Mark's Gospel, we've got these constant reminders that power isn't power over anything. It's power over the demons. Yes, they obey Jesus's command, but here his power derives from obedience, not from exercise of will.
Yeah. Yes. This is very interesting. Yeah. Here I just put a picture of Chiron. It's a fresco from Era, close to Pompeii, Herculanum. And Chiron has been read in like medieval period, for instance, as a figure of Christ as well. So it's a centaur, so half divine, half animal, human creature of the Greek mythology. And Chiron was a centaur, but he was also wounded by an arrow. Oh, I can't remember exactly the story, I think. That was dumped by Hercules. I think Hercules wounded him. But he, as a centaur, he couldn't die. So he was wounded, but he couldn't die. So he had this wound that wouldn't heal because there was the arrow was poisonous because of the blood of Hydra, I think, that was on it. But he became, he was considered also the wisest of all and the justest, the most like full of wisdom of all the centaurs. And he became the teacher of Achilles. Achilles, yes. So here you see him teaching Achilles. So it's an example of the form of leadership, probably linked to wisdom, that was read into a figure of Jesus that was read into a Greek mythology.
Yeah, it's very powerful. Who wrote that book called The Wounded Healer? Henry Nouwen, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Just a little introduction into this mystical thing. It's going to be very short, but this whole idea of service in Mark's Gospel, as I've mentioned, is quite strong here, and it comes out of this very, very bold statement that the Son of Man has come to serve and not to be served. Who's the Son of Man serving? Because we've seen many little pictures in Mark's Gospel already of people who serve, or beings, characters that serve other things. So the demons that are serving Beelzebub, for instance, the rich man who's serving his riches, the Pharisees who are serving the law, and Herod who's serving his own interests, essentially, this old fox. So it seems as if Mark is pointing out time and time again in Jesus' teaching that we're always going to serve something or somebody, whether we know it or not. That's who we are. That something or someone may be ourselves, but we are all in the business of serving something or someone. And it's worth meditating on Mark's Gospel in the light of that saying, really, and to see those people's stories with that framework in mind. This is just a reading from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a little poem that he wrote called Christians and Pagans, because he's sort of comparing the two. But the very interesting thing about this is the way he turns it halfway through to say that power and need are sort of linked here. Perhaps we could just read it. People turn to God when they're in need, plead for help, contentment, and for bread, for rescue from their sickness, guilt, and death. They all do so, both Christian and pagan. We all want that deliverance, Nothing unusual about wanting to be delivered from sickness, guilt, death, praying for bread and happiness. We think that's normal. But then he turns it round. Look, people turn to God in God's own need and find God poor, degraded, without roof or bread. See God devoured by sin, weakness, and death. Christians stand with God to share God's pain. God turns to all people in their need, nourishes body and soul with God's own bread, takes up the cross for Christians and pagans both, and in forgiving both is slain. So there's an identity here saying the Christian way is not to plead with a powerful God to give us happiness, health, contentment, bread, a roof over our heads, that our primary call is to stand with God, to share God's pain, to become the servant of all. And in the end, we see how becoming the servant of all means we nourish all. We take up the cross for all, the suffering of others too. And in forgiving both, we're talking here of Christ, himself is the offering.
Yeah.
This is drinking the cup, being baptized into the death, and that religion isn't about serving our own happiness or our own need for bread and safety, although of course we pray for that for people. But if we cannot stand next to the cross, bear each other's burdens, for in so doing we fulfill the law of Christ. That's Paul. Then we're just being pagans. We're not being Christians.
Yes, that's interesting.
There's a solid
this communality of passion and pain.
Yeah, he wrote it just before he died. It was written in July 1944. Yeah. This is from Dorothy with 3 E's there somehow. She's got herself an extra E. The Silent Cry, Mysticism and Resistance. From the initial situation of seeking help from God, pleading for help, praying for fortune, praying for bread, she's referring here to Bonhoeffer, that's common to pagans and Christians, and which Bonhoeffer would have called the religion of those not come of age. The way of discipleship leads to being dragged into the messianic suffering of God in Jesus Christ, in which human beings share in God's impotence. This is the very reversal of everything the religious person expects from God. Humans are called to share in God's suffering, to suffer with God the godlessness of the world. Remember, this is also the way of St. John of the Cross, and of Teresa as well, when they talk about the initial stages there of coming to God, being asking for bread, asking for comfort, asking for deliverance. But the closer you get to God, sometimes the darker, more mysterious, the more absent God seems to be. And this is drinking the cup. This is being baptized into the baptism that Jesus himself was baptized into. Do you want to read the next few bits?
What does love look like? It has the hands to help others. It has the feet to hasten to the poor and needy. It has eyes to see misery and want. It has the ears to hear the sighs and sorrows of men. That is what love looks like.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's all about seeing and hearing and hastening to the poor.
And serving. I mean, it comes to servanthood.
Yes.
In the end, it's not a concept.
No, it's not. No. That's good old Saint Augustine. And Teresa.
Yeah. Oh, my Lord, how true it is that whoever works for you is paid in troubles. And what a precious price to those who love you, if we understand its value. That reminds me of actually the little joke that was part of a bio, since yesterday was the feast of Teresa of Avila. So she went around Spain establishing, I think, 15 monasteries or something like this. And one time her carriage fell into a muddy river, and she cried out to God and complained to him, saying, "Why, God, this happened to me?" And God answered to her, because she had private conversations with God, "This is how I treat my friends." And she answered,
"Yes, no wonder you have so few of them."
Voilà. So that's an example of this way of service, right? And you can still
Yes.
be joyful and playful with it, of course, and make humor out of it. But that's how it works, right? And now this last quote from John of the Cross: "The purest suffering bears and carries in its train the purest understanding."
That's a very condensed saying, isn't it? But I think that, John of the Cross certainly suffered from his imprisonment and his torture, actually, and was being fed on bread and water for years on end as he was...
What strikes me in this is that, the circular way of putting it maybe would be suffering bears and carries understanding, you see? But he says the purest suffering bears and carries in its train the purest understanding. And it kind of set things, because here in purest it means it's a form of suffering that's not self-centered either, you see? And an understanding that's not purely functional, but has some form of, spiritual dimension to it.
It's funny, isn't it, how sometimes in recent decades there's been this idea that the biggest victim is the one that is closest to God. So I am more persecuted than you are, therefore I have perversely more proximity to God and more power than you have. And that is not at all what we're talking about here, because it's not my suffering that counts. It really isn't my suffering that counts. I had a wonderful spiritual director once who said all of our struggles for our dignity and the dignity of others are profoundly linked. I cannot separate my suffering from the suffering of another. That's not the way it works. My suffering is no more valuable than the suffering of a neighbour, or no less valuable than it. That it must lead us to that place by the cross, as Bonhoeffer talked about.
It is very clarifying.
Well, there we are.
Here we are. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to share with us. It's been really, all this, I felt like I was plunged into the baptism that Christ was talking about as we, investigate and meditate on this text and look at it from different angles. It's always very, very enriching, I find.
Yes, and you've got to write a sermon for Sunday. So.
I do. I don't know.
Well, please feel free to put questions there. We always look at the comments afterwards as well, and in our little discussion in the Zoom group that is about to follow as well. So we're going to say good night for now. If you want to join us in the Zoom, you know where to find us, either by messaging the church's office or by going to our website and clicking on programs and filling in the little form there. So thanks for joining us and listening, and God bless. Our prayers are with you for the weekend to come, as well as we reflect in community on that on Sunday.
God bless you. Dieu vous
God
garde.
bless and good night.